Cosmic Skeptic gave an interview with Chris Williamson. One of the interesting things that he said is he stops the debates on God doesn't exist. And the reason he stops is because he feels guilty. Because people keep coming up to him and saying, I'm so glad that you were able to prove and convince me that God doesn't exist. But what do I do now? And he's like, I don't have an answer. You better
Joke's on you,
have
nerd.
an answer to that question.
Say
And
Christ
so he's
is
like,
Lord.
now I just don't like putting people in that position where they are having an existential crisis. Like,
I do.
We have some breaking news, ladies and gentlemen. There has been some new evidence that has been uncovered on the Shroud of Turin. If you don't know what that is, it is the shroud that Jesus Christ was buried in before he was risen from the dead. And welcome to another episode of the I'm Telling God About This podcast. We are going to dissect the details of this breaking news, the details of when they originally thought this was a forgery from the medieval times, and then what some of this dating and new research is now showing as to the potential realities of this actually being the garment that was buried with Jesus. Stick around because we're going to get into all the details of the other evidence we have alongside of the Shroud of Turin around the realistic reality of Jesus being on earth, being a man in the flesh who was raised from the dead. Gentlemen, I'm excited for this hot topic.
awesome. Yeah, me too. I think what's interesting about this is that it has been hailed as the pinnacle of evidence when we have so much evidence for the resurrection, historical evidence of Jesus's existence, his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection.
Here's my question to you, Anderson, on that comment, because I try and regularly reflect the more nominal Christian viewpoint because I'm not steeped in the theological traditions that you gentlemen are.
You try to stride the cultural Christian viewpoint?
I am not calling myself a cultural Christian. Do not go there. When you make that statement, I don't know what you mean, because I legitimately am like, wait, what are the evidences for the historicity of Jesus? You just said there are so many. From the outside world looking in, my brain just goes to, channeling the outsider's view, the historicity of the books of the Bible and the period of time in which and when they were written. Like, I think that's widely known. But when you say, there's so much evidence, why do we need another piece? I don't know what so much evidence you're talking about.
We'll get into that. I think we'll save that for after we do an initial analysis on what that is.
Well,
stick around,
Josh. Before you go into like kind of the details with the shroud, though, but this is a really good point. I mean, I literally had a conversation this week about. I mean, I have conversations like this all the time, but one earlier this week, specifically, where you get people who come in and they're like, the Bible, but like Constantine and like the Dead Sea Scrolls and I'm just sitting there.
When I hear "but Constantine," I it's
kind of like I just want to look, and I'm like, and this is what I've come to start telling people is I'm like, I don't make excuses for humans or human institutions, but like, if you're gonna come in here and try to assert that like there's no historical evidence or that we don't require reasoned faith, then I'm like, then you're going to have to commit to actually coming in here and sitting down and having a conversation, and actually laying this out. Because to your point, Nick, just there's so much bad information out there.
Correct.
And so much weirdness. And I think that is what makes the Shroud of Turin so interesting, is because, especially from a Protestant view, which if you haven't been paying attention, that's the team we're on. We're not big on relics as a general rule. In fact, generally frowned upon in this establishment. So,
and I get that, but it's just another one of those situations where same with I have this sympathy for the
don't say iconography,
the position of the Reformed, right, and some of this other stuff, and I just sure, it's not the team I'm on, but I feel like maybe as Protestants we're a little too gung ho about sweeping away everything that belongs to
we throw the baby out with the bathwater for sure.
Tim, we found something we agree on.
No, I'll keep talking.
Just
keep
give him a
talking
little more
about
time.
it.
This episode, Tim's gonna have an icon of St.
Yeah.
Paul on the back of his wall.
That's what
there,
you need to
guys.
order on
Right
Amazon.
now, I'm gonna have the Cairo inscribed right behind me.
Alongside our Cryptus Crypto.
Yeah, with Jordan.
Bitcoin.
Oh, Christus Crypto.
Or
We need
Christus
that.
Crypto. Yeah.
That's
Jordan
still,
Peterson's-
No, that's still borderline sacrilege.
Yeah,
it
it
makes
is.
me uncomfortable to
It is
even
just to
revisit
say
that.
those words.
That was on the line for me, guys.
I love
I think
Jordan
that was like
Peterson's-
unfilmed. We didn't publish.
No,
the
that
Christus
wasn't up
Crypto.
there.
That was like behind the curtain.
Oh,
But I
okay,
will
good.
throw that in right
Jordan
here.
Peterson
I'll edit that
did not
picture
like.
in.
I loved Jordan Peterson's. I love his iconography, like print jacket suit that
Yeah.
he has. I'm like, I'm not
Oh,
really into the
yes.
icons, but I'm really liking that. And there's like,
His-
I don't know if you saw this either, but in Ukraine, they're taking the sappy plates, like the armor plates of guys who have been shot and lived, and then they're painting icons on them, like they're
No
doing like the gold leaf
way.
icons. And I called one of my buddies up who's over there, and I'm like, listen, dude, like, how do I get one of those? Like, you get me? And he's like,
That's awesome.
he's like,
So
Josh,
epic.
but these are very important for my people. I was like, yeah,
I get it. Look, hey, that's your ticket onto the Sean Ryan show, bro. That's it.
That's
Just bring
so
him.
true.
no, that's
Bring
going
him
right.
the
It's gonna be hanging like right here, It's right over my
Get two.
shoulder.
Get two.
Anyway,
All right.
Anyway,
what are we talking
Can we
about
talk
here,
about
guys?
the cultural significance of it, though?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, let's do
I had
that.
this thought that, and I just want to frame it this way, because for so long, for what, the past, 2.5 decades, it's been broadly ingrained in our culture that the Shroud of Turin was fake, a fraud, a
Right.
mid, first millennium or second millennium forgery and all this stuff. And it's so much so that I remembered when I was reading Dresden Files, there's one book that focuses actually using the Shroud of Turin as one of like the magical artifacts. And for those of you who don't know, this is a book series that's literally about like wizards and magic and fairies and all this stuff. Like a bunch of
got a good
unbelievable
Christian
stuff.
stuff your
though.
parents wouldn't let you read if you were a good Baptist child. Anyway, continue.
That's right.
In the context of this clearly fantasy series, the author had to be like, insert this dialogue where it was like, oh, but the Shroud of Turin is fake. Why does it have any power? And it's like, well, if enough people believe something has power, then it develops power. It's like, you're telling me you're writing about wizards and fairies, and you had to be like, oh, but science tells us that the Shroud of Turin is a fake. Like, that's how deeply ingrained this idea that this, and it was based on, and I haven't like read super deeply about it, but the carbon dating that was supposed to have debunked the authenticity of it was intentionally performed on a patch
Yes.
on the shroud that was very obviously done later. And you would only
Nefarious.
do that if you specifically wanted to have some evidence to say it was a fake. And it's like, well, hold on a second. If like the fact that this thing could be authentically dated to the 50, 30 AD, somewhere in there, shouldn't cause a problem. Like, I'm sure atheists are aware that cloth was created around that time frame. Like, this shouldn't cause a problem
Yeah,
for them.
but the whole photo negative 2 micron deep,
No, I get
Yeah,
that.
we'll get there.
But
We'll get
here's
there.
the thing. Why fake it?
right.
Yeah.
Like, why fake
Well, let me
the,
get into
the
that.
debunking
Let me get into that.
of...
We'll need to
Because
bring in
that's
a Roman Catholic and ask them what benefit
you
there
just
is
brought
for having
up,
relics.
Is that a premise? Because I did like that. Sounds like now we're discussing the conspiracy theory of the possibility that it was intentionally dated incorrectly.
Let's pause.
Which,
Let's pause on that because that is what's come out after this news has been released. So like,
Right.
all I'm
Let
going
me
to
just-
say is you're bringing up new information, and I'm going to turn it over to Anderson to give us a little bit more clarity and context. But like what you just shared, Tim, is even news to me. Of like, wait, there's a conspiracy that it was intentionally misdated. Like, I kind of am excited to hear back to the whole operate more on surface level from you three deep theologians. So Anderson, take it away, my man. Give us the deets.
So basically, there's been a lot of writings on this. The kind of the going story is that it originally turned up, arriving in like Constantinople in around 944 or so, and then from there, Greece after it was sacked, and it went to from the Crusaders around 1204 to France, and then eventually it went to Italy around 1325, 1355 sometime frame. But the problem is that even in the earliest sources, you have a bishop that was writing to the Pope, or I think it was Pope Clement at the time, basically saying, hey, this is totally a forgery. This is from, so let me share the document here that I have. I think this will be pretty interesting. So according to this was a memorandum of Pierre de Arcis, Bishop of Troyes. He was really talking about the diocese, or at least there was a dean of Liry, or a cathedral there, that was hosting the Shroud of Turin. And in it, he's talking about, like, clearly, like, this is a forgery. I'm really, really saddened that this is basically just gaining money. One of the things he says, the reasons, is because it wasn't in the Gospels, that it, couldn't possibly be. He says, for many theologians and otherwise persons declared that this could not be the real Shroud of the Lord, the Savior likeness thus imprinted upon it, since the Holy Gospel made no mention of any such imprint. Like, if it's not in the Gospel, therefore it's not real. Well, if it had been true, it was quite unlikely that the holy evangelists would have admitted to record it, or that the fact that should have remained hidden until present time. Eventually, after diligent inquiry and examination, he discovered the fraud and how the said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth being attested by the artist who had painted it, to wit, that it was the work of human skill and not miraculously wrought or bestowed. The problem with this is, it's not paint. There's no dyes or pigments on it. It's actual blood.
What was the date on that document? Blood. What was the date on that document?
This was
something.
This was like 1389.
So was that the first?
I think this is the first
historical commentary around the Shroud of Turin
this
that
is the first
have.
That I have been able to find. But again, I'm not a church history scholar by any means. So these are just what I was able to find from other references on other scholarly articles. Here's the thing. I'm trying to get the source documents for everyone so that I'm not just going off of an article, or I'm not just going off of a other scholar. Like if it's claiming to say something, and it's referencing it, let's look at the source. Let's decide for ourselves.
Yeah, but the relevant subject matter today, though, in terms of the authenticity, has a lot more to do with the forensic evidence of it. I mean, you can argue, source documents and what did people at the time, think of it, and so on. But and I guess there's this guy. He's a Jesuit, so But Robert
the Society
Spitzer,
of Jesus.
I'm just saying, it's not like if the moment I found out he was a Jesuit, I was like, well, maybe the shroud is fake, But
That's hilarious.
The Jesuits went far and wide. What was it,
dude?
Josh,
I told you this.
When you were,
yeah, dude. We ran across. We went to places in China back in the day where we rolled up. We were like, hey, have you and I'm talking like way away from electricity, far away, and it's like, hey, have you guys heard about this guy named Jesus? And they're like, oh, yeah, we heard about him. I was like, from who? It's like our great-great-grandparents. And it's like, wait, what do you mean? They've got some, hybrid form of, Buddhist animism and, Catholicism going on because the Jesuits rolled through there, 200 years ago.
It's
just random pockets of...
The Jesuits have such a conspiratorial, sketchy reputation that in one of the Three Musketeers sequels, written by Alexander Dumas, Aramis, one of the three, actually becomes the general of the Society of Jesus, and that's part of his plot to replace the French king with his masked twin brother.
Oh, the man in the Iron Mask. Is that one?
Yeah.
Man in the Iron
but
Mask.
it has nothing to do with the movie. The actual plot is much
deeper.
Thicker.
Wow.
Listen, the Disney movie, The Three Musketeers with
about?
Porthos, that's the best one for sure. Just why we're talking about this. If you could
the
cut
thread that ties this conversation together so far is Europe.
Correct. And Catholicism and plots to enslave humanity and benefit from the gullibility of a mass populace.
Oh yeah, but this guy, Robert Spitzer, he's done basically the Gary Habermas on the Shroud of Turin, basically. I realize that's probably not an accessible reference for the non-theologian crowd.
Or non-liberty
anyway,
crowd.
He's gone really deep on the authenticity of it and collected and compiled a lot of evidence
But here's what's
suggesting its authenticity.
Here's the thing that's interesting, though, to me. Like, I think, just even looking at this, you know, we talk about this a lot. I said this a minute ago, where it's like we hear all the time from Protestants and through Christians and other Christians where it's like, we don't need all these relics. Like, we don't need to worry about, you don't need to study all of the data and like get into the historicity and like you spend too much time in apologetics. Listen, just preach the gospel. That's all you need to do. That's all you need to do. And I'm like, okay, look, I understand that. And especially over the last several thousand years. However, we, and this gets back again to like what God has placed us. If you were born in this context and you're watching this on a device capable of displaying it in 1080p or whatever, then like I'm talking to you. We were born in an era where the general intelligence level and competency level is orders like I cannot even express that. Like, if this is why Army of Darkness was the thing. Like, if I took Jim Bob from Alabama and dropped him into medieval Europe, he's a wizard. Okay,
This is my boomstick.
Yeah. Like, go ahead, cut that in, right? Like,
All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up. See this? This is my boomstick!
you're a wizard now, okay? So what I mean by that is that, like, this idea that, like, there's a unique barrier at this time in history to the gospel that maybe was less of an issue in previous centuries, and it's because we're an overeducated population. And so and
the opposition is armed up for that type of
they
conflict.
Are because they're
and
dealing
so when
in
you
that.
have people who ideologically oppose you, who have claimed most of the institutions that would adjudicate what we would think of as evidence, you're immediately you're starting behind.
Correct.
when you're having a strictly rational argument there. And so because of that, I do think there's a lot of, and I've even seen this online as the whole Shroud conversation
has been
took
unshrouded.
place, was that get out.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
But that there's a certain number of Christians who are basically nervous about even believing in what looks like good evidence, because my impression is that they feel like they would be shifting the foundation of their faith onto something that some group of nefarious scientists is going to come and knock out from under them in another 10 years and say, well, actually carbon dating. And so they just say, no, I don't want to blah, blah, blah. But here's the thing. That's not how anybody in the Christian tradition, going back to Jesus, has ever treated, or before that, even in the Old Testament, has ever treated miracles, right? Because that's really what we're talking about here. The Shroud of Turin is only significant in the sense that it's believed to be actual evidence of a miracle. The difference is we didn't see it firsthand, we're seeing the aftermath of it. And I don't think that when Jesus announced that he was like forgiving the lame man of his sins, he says, your sins are forgiven. And the Pharisees are like, you can't forgive sins. And he says, and this was obviously a beautiful rhetorical trap, and I'm paraphrasing for those of you who are gonna
in the comment section that's gonna try to crucify us for not quoting scripture exactly. You know, Peter summarized scripture, Paul summarized scripture, so you can take it up with them.
Summarized
Go ahead,
scripture.
Tim. Yeah, that's right.
Anyway.
He goes, what's harder to say, or what is easier, whichever. He says, what's easier, to tell a man your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? Now, like on one hand, like in the very terrestrial sense, it seems harder to say get up and walk, because like the proof of that, you're gonna, the rubber's gonna meet the road right there. Obviously, we know that it's much harder thing to, sacrifice the Son of the living God to effectuate the forgiveness of sins, and that's the trap, right? But the foundation of the faith was not, that Jesus said this guy could get up and walk. He was asserting his authority over the created order of things. So all of these miracles and these evidence of miracles, and evidence is generally, and this is very much the C.S. Lewis position on miracles, these are signposts that point to faith.
Right.
And your faith isn't based on it, but in the same way that you might have experiences that bolster your faith because, you felt the hand of God showing up in a real way in some situation. You're not saying you would have lost your faith had things gone a different way, or if God hadn't provided in that specific way in that time, but that doesn't change the fact that it's an edifying thing to have, to reflect on, and to help point you back to the actual source.
And
right. And
if I might hop
go
right
ahead.
in there, Tim, to your point explicitly, I think that's the right way to look at it. And I don't want to dismiss them, but I don't think believers and Christians should be too quick to dismiss the Shroud of Turin and other forms of evidence. When I got to go to Israel, one of my really crescendo moments that took place, having grown up in the church my entire life, and like literally it's all I've ever known, was that we do a disservice to our faith by not conversing and making ourselves familiar with the components of historicity. Because when you go to Israel and you see the sites and the locations and the places and the things that were discovered as recently as like 20 years ago, 10 years ago, last year, now we're talking about the Shroud of Turin, the big thing that happened to me was there, per the signpost analogy, there is still a faith jump. No one is arguing that there is not a faith jump. I just think that it is not as much of a chasm as we too easily make it out to be.
For sure.
Well, when I went to
Thomas
Israel,
was an apostle.
When I went to Israel, it was like, wait a minute, this is like a hop, skip, and a little jump here, like to go from like, oh my gosh, Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And I feel like it's cool when we get to talk about the science and historicity of it all, because it connects the dots so beautifully.
Well, let me connect those dots real quick, because first of all, Christians, you are ordered to always have a defense ready for the hope that you have. 1 Peter 3:15, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense, apologetic, to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. And as it pertains to faith, faith never meant blind faith, blind belief. It never meant that. Pistis, the way that it's meant in the contemporary writings of the first century as well, as far back to the the Septuagint and everything. Faith is something that is evidence based. Could be mean faithfulness or trust. Really is I think a good way to put it. So something that you trust in. And if you look at Hebrews 11, I think that really solidifies it, right? If we look at it now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. If we look at the actual verb, let me just show you guys here, because I think this would be a good way to kind of bring it together. If we look at Blue Letter Bible, right? We take the word faith or conviction or the evidence, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the conviction or the evidence of things unseen. I mean, this word means the proof, something that a thing is proven or tested, or the conviction of it. So, I mean, this is not something, when we talk about faith, I get so frustrated oftentimes when people outside of Christianity look at faith and they try to define it as this blind thing. No, faith is something that is always something to hang your hat on, something to just be solid, evidence that you trust that is there. Now, granted, there's things that you have. Evidence is also subjective as well. I mean, you look at Kierkegaard, the highest form of belief or trust or faith is that leap of faith, that subjective truth, where I believe that the microphone that I have in front of me is able to take the signals and send them to you. And that's why I'm talking into it. Because I trust that that is the case, right? That's a leap into faith for that. So,
and this is
leap
what
into
happens.
faith is the.
Yeah, exactly. Leap into faith. My thing is this is what people. The reason that the, I hate to say, like, the detractors of Christianity want to, why they're constantly thinking like they have the upper hand, is because they're not encountering these situations. You know, I have people who come in and they start into me with this same idea, and they're like, oh yeah, evidence. Oh, well, your faith, like me, I'm too scientifically minded. And I'm like, well, sit down. Let's talk about your well thought out, evidentiary based worldview. And when I proceed to light it on fire because it is so much flash paper, right? And then proceed to make coffee or do 50 other things, why they just attempt to pull at the strong and rooted foundation that is what, Christianity is based on, they start to realize they're like, okay, I've made a miscalculation. Like, and I'm not saying that's about me specific. I'm just saying, like, if you are doing what Josh has talked about or what we're speaking about here, like if you're actually paying attention to the actual evidence, like we have two different kinds of revelation that we talk about. Like God gave us general revelation and specific revelation. General revelation is what we see around us. And spoiler alert, that's enough to condemn you to hell. So like there's enough there for that on its face. And then,
hey, that's a good episode. We should do that.
Well, yeah, for sure. But like, and then like beyond that, we have specific revelation. And the specific revelation is the unique message for, people in time and space. And what we see in like, what's amazing with things like the Shroud is that it's secondary information. It's secondary evidence. So what's funny is it's being treated as like a primary external source of supporting evidence from the Bible, but the only reason it means anything is because we can read a historically reliable document that gives us the context for it. So like that's the funny thing to me is like what is the Shroud other than a stained sheet if you didn't have some sort of historically reliable piece of evidence?
Because it's religious, because not because it's religious, because it's gospel oriented. Everything that purports to provide evidentiary support for the gospel is subject to a bizarrely higher standard
always
than anything else.
Always.
Like if this was the shroud that Buddha had been born in, like there's relics of
turns out
religions
Buddhism
all
is
over the
true,
world that are
and
just
it's shaking up global, like that's how it would literally read that way. It would be like Buddha was real and it's sending waves through the whole thing.
By that,
right? Because there's no actual support.
And that's why you see, because like Nick said, he hadn't even seen the thing about like the notion that it was like a nefarious plot that, so there was a fire in a church in France where the shroud was kept. Apparently it's well documented. I'm just taking somebody else's word for that. And apparently it's a conspicuous patch that was used to repair the shroud. And so when they did the 1988 carbon dating to establish the age of it, because it's like, okay, well, if it wouldn't prove that it was real, but hypothetically it would prove that it was fake if the carbon dating didn't line up, right? Apparently they took one strand from this patch, and even like the composition, like the patch is plainly something that was done afterwards because the type of fabric, the cotton, like whatever, it just weren't things that would have existed in the Levant around the time period of Christ. And so you can't do that by accident. You can't accidentally think, oh, here's this giant, let's just cherry pick this one little.
We have to trust the science.
Oh my gosh.
Like, of course we trust the science.
And here's the thing. I don't necessarily think that those are people who because whoever perpetrated it was obviously dishonest and fraudulent on purpose.
Yes.
I don't think that those were people who were saying, I think that Jesus might have been real and we got to stop people from believing in him. What I think happened is more like, well, I already know that this religion is stupid. My worldview says that Christianity is a huge obstacle to everything that I, as the high-minded science man, want to happen. So I'm going to find ways to destroy the possibility of faith in a Machiavellian way, in the sense that I don't care about the means that I use to, even if they're because if I convince people that the shroud is false and they then believe that the resurrection didn't happen or whatever, then they will have ended up at a true belief, even if it's for the wrong reason. That's the level of manipulation that they're people who know better than you, trying to make sure that you come to the right conclusions, and it doesn't matter how you got there or how they led you there.
And that's the same thing that's happening in, not to take us to a different direction on this, but like it's a parallel track, but like this is what like Christians argue for, saying, hey, this is why we want to teach the Bible in schools. Why wouldn't we do that? It's historically relevant. It's a historical document. It's the primary faith. Like, I mean, it's the main faith of our country.
It's the foundations.
It's the foundation of all these different things. Like, just that on its face. I'm not saying you can't teach evolution, but like you can't sit here and say that you're being objective. Like, what are you afraid of?
There's this There's just this weird tension on that debate for me because, like, on one hand, it's like, oh, we should teach the Bible in schools, and I'm like, we shouldn't have public schools.
I don't know. Hey, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar.
We are not the same.
Yes. No, you're right.
Let me. So we kind of touched on some of the earliest mentions of the Shroud of Turin, and I heard that you guys really touched on the initial 1988
Did you hear all of that?
test.
Where you're using?
Yeah. So sorry. Hey guys, I have.
Oh man, if I'd known you were listening and you couldn't respond.
Yeah, I have responsibilities as a dad. It was somebody had to go to the bathroom, so you got to help that.
Oh, you are good.
Anyway,
priorities.
Was it you?
Anyway, so it wasn't me that. All right, so we kind of touched on all that, but so the article that came out that everybody is talking about, and I will go ahead and share it for everybody. Let me just read the abstract that kind of talks about how they did it, what their conclusions were, and some of the cool things with that. So basically this was done by, I think it was like 5 Italian scientists or so. Anyway, so the abstract, it says, on the sample of the Shroud of Turin, or the Turin Shroud, TS, we applied new method for dating ancient linen threads by inspecting their structural degradation by means of the wide-angle X-ray scattering. The X-ray dating method was applied to the sample of the TS consisting of the thread taken in proximity of the 1988 radiocarbon dating area. So it was in proximity of that, so that if this gets a different result, we can essentially maybe throw out or potentially question the 1988 study. All right, so the corner of the TS corresponding to the feet area of the frontal image near the so-called rays sample. Anyway, the size of the linen sample was about yada, yada, yada. We obtained one dimension integrated with this X-ray testing wide angle data profile with the TS sample, which were fully compatible with the analogous measurements obtained on a linen sample whose dating, according to the historical record, is 55 to 74 AD. Now, this is important. They did the comparison. Their control test, their North Star, was to say, here we're measuring this from the siege of Masada's cloth that was found. It was dated to around 55 to 74 AD, which is in the margin of error of what they would be expecting.
Right?
So that's their control.
Masada. I got to walk up to Masada. I know exactly where
awesome
this
stuff
is and what we're discussing.
Yeah. So, all right. So the degree of natural aging of the cellulose that constitutes the linen of the investigated sample obtained by X-ray analysis showed that the Turin Shroud fabric is much older than the 7th centuries proposed by the 1988 radiocarbon dating. The experimental results are compatible with the hypothesis that the TS is 2,000-year-old relic, as supposed by the Christian tradition, under the conditions. Now, here's the caveat. Under the conditions that it was kept at suitable levels of average secular temperature of 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius. Josh, you're in Europe. What is 20 to 22.5?
Dude, I don't do math in public, and I definitely don't do it on camera.
72.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So what does that mean?
Yeah, how dare you?
Room temperature. If it was kept at room temperature, it's authentic. Of course, now you also have to understand the relative humidity was about 75 to 55. Now, this was at the 13th century, 13 centuries before we actually knew where it was being held. So we have to assume for 13 centuries that it was kept at basically room temperature, and that it was at a average humidity between 75 and 55%.
Because on some level, the difference here is going from one fraudulent piece of evidence that said this definitely is fraud, the idea that it's that old is incompatible with evidence, and now we're saying
it's probable.
Actually, it very plausibly could be, right? So I don't have to say, oh, well, if you assume this and you assume this, it's just like, well, actually, maybe it kind of seems like it's possible that it is what it.
That's really good. I'm glad you say this, because this is one of the big things, and I just want to explain this to, especially to people as you're having these conversations about any evidence, whether or not it's the textual critical evidence, or if it's historical evidence, whatever it is. Here's something that we always have to forget. We've mentioned this before, that there, for some reason, it's not really a surprise, there's this higher standard, higher burden of proof placed on Christianity above everything else. People are more willing to have a good faith argument about string theory than they are about actual historical, narrative evidence that's in the Bible. And so here's what I would tell you. You do not have to have the best answer. You just have to have a better answer than the one that exists. And here's the cool thing. That's not hard, because believe it or not, the majority of stuff that gets passed around as like verified or, solid or, the generally understood, like when you actually look at the statistics and you look at the data, you look at what the actual, maybe it's like a 20 or 30% chance, and it's like, that's pretty good. Yeah, in astrophysics it's pretty good, but like I'm not getting on a plane with a 20 to 30% chance of being accurate. Like, so just remember that. Like, you don't have to have the best answer. It just has to be better than the next best answer.
Right. Well, and that brings us, so if, for instance, the Shroud of Turin is something that can be seen as reliable, or at least more reliable than the previous study, that's something that people should, and I think are taking into an account. I think one of the interesting things that I'm less, confident about is the AI renditions of the image. I don't know if you guys
they're awesome.
have seen this. I think that this is pretty funny. Really, it's okay, I suppose. It's pretty good. I've seen other artists in like renditions, but this is like the AI apparently. I don't know if that looks to me like what I saw in the
Pull
negative.
the shroud up.
But okay.
So that's what I was going to get at while you're pulling the shroud up. So I don't know about you guys, but again, just to continually bring us back to this perspective, I was raised Presbyterian. We already lean away from miracles in that denomination anyway. So, like, my entire life, I have lived in the steeped culture of you're just supposed to believe. And I've never even seen a real picture of the Shroud of Turin. So, like, I am enjoying this conversation, and I think arguably a lot of other people are going to be enjoying this conversation because, like, this is all new information for me. So I am loving when Anderson talks about the actual blood, the forensic evidence. This is like me finding all of this out for the first time, and I'm like just like on the edge of my seat with some popcorn. So like to this end, I love this conversation, and I'm learning so much because I was over here Googling pictures of the shroud, and I'm like, I didn't even know.
Yeah.
I didn't even know it was the full length of a man. I always just assumed it was some scrap of some shred of some 1 to 2 foot
it's like 14
piece of
feet.
cloth.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
It's 14 feet,
I didn't know
but that's
any
the
of
front
this.
and the back of it. Yeah. So,
Again, I'm loving this.
One of the things that I love about I think to me the most compelling thing about this is the photonegative evidence. Like,
yes, agreed.
To me,
agreed.
To me, that is something that you just So let's just take
What
the
does that
full
mean?
margin.
Discuss it.
Let me explain.
Discuss it.
So basically, it's effectively when light passes through something and it basically effectively burns off or bleaches or changes one material, degrades it, so that wherever the light had the fastest route through is going to be kind of burned away, and wherever there was shade is going to have less of an effect of the light, right? It's like a sunburn. If you've ever done like sunscreen on your hand or whatever and then gone out in the sun, same idea. But the point is that to basically flash impression linen fiber in that level,
that technology wasn't when
available. So even if you take the worst, like it basically increases from my view, right? You have to look at things like, okay, so what's the full margin of probability of time that this linen could have existed? So maybe it doesn't dial down to like the actual decade with a high level of probability, but I'll tell you what is with a high level of probability. They didn't have halogen bulbs that could have effectively done that, at that period of time. Like and when you consider what the actual shape is itself, not only are you thinking you have to create something that bright, but you have to do it in the shape of a body, like where it's clear that it was like that doesn't.
And there's been many claims that it's been recreated, but I don't think that there's ever been a good explanation.
Not with natural.
That. In fact, that there's. Exactly, with some of the things that the negative image, the three-dimensional information, the absence of pigment or inks or
the depth,
paints,
which
would
depth of the
would
marking
contradict the original citing by the bishop.
The marking being that image as I guess only imprinted on like the topmost layer of just a tiny which you could get. I guess again, I'm not like a a physicist who deals with these things. I'm just regurgitating what I've read, but the idea being that you could only get that by a really short, high-intensity burst of light.
Yep.
Like, that's interesting.
I think so.
Kind of like
Because I also
compelling.
think when it comes to
what does the
when
Bible
it comes
say? I
to
don't know, Tim.
miracles,
What does the Bible say about bright lights and holy divine figures? Right, like when angels or the Lord appears to people. What's
No,
that light?
you mean
like?
what
Like,
do the
all the light?
historically
look at what-
relevant texts say about the narrative?
right?
Yeah.
See, we need to find the cloak that Paul was wearing on the road to Damascus and compare
you
the
go.
two.
Hey, if we don't have the
just some
actual
science.
scales that fell from his eyes, I'm not believing.
Do you know what's crazy to
It's
me? If you haven't seen it, we need to link his page in here. But the biblical archaeology dude, do you know which one I'm talking about on YouTube?
From Liberty?
Oh, that
No.
guy.
No, there's a way better guy. He's really good. He's like a legit archaeologist, but he's gone out and he's done some really good, focused on specific scientific archaeological finds. And he makes very clear. He doesn't do like really speculative stuff. It's literally like, this is what we read in the Bible. This is exactly what it describes. And I'm an archaeologist. And let me show you where we found that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And at one of these
Yes.
places, one of the things he found, which I think is just awesome, is these massive bronze scales and super oversized spearheads and all this other stuff. And
right.
it's with like a Philistine camp from the right time period. And for those of you who don't know where I'm going with this, giants.
My brother in Christ. my brother
Everybody
in
who
Christ.
has ever met
Are you
giants
John in
talking
person
about
knows where he's going
the
with
Nephilim.
talking
this.
about the sons of God?
That's right. No,
that
I'm talking
went
about the
into daughters of
offspring. These were the
women,
mighty men of
or
old,
men.
the mighty men of
Yes.
renown. Perhaps you've heard of
Yes.
them. The
Interesting.
Rephaim.
$1 in a
Anyway,
jar.
but what my point is that, you know, when you go, he goes to like the museum in Israel and they're like, oh, and here are these decorative suits of armor and decorative weapons that were made. I'm like, dude, do you like, how do you as a secular scholar, you know, in the Bronze Age, like these weapons were not like common. It even talks about like only royalty like having them, and you think they're just making decorative armor and decorative spearheads?
Way bigger with way more material
Right.
than would be.
They're you like you could Google it. Maybe we could throw it up in here. But anyway, we'll link this guy's channel, and it's really good
Apparently,
stuff.
we can do a whole series on, you know, biblically
And
based
we
archaeology.
should.
Which would be really
Absolutely.
fun.
Yeah, but
Like,
So
do you
let
think
me-
the
let-
Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia?
Don't go
it's-
there now.
it's at the
That's so
Smithsonian.
fascinating.
you have
Dude, no, Indiana Jones
Top
absolutely found
man.
that thing.
top men.
I mean, absolutely.
Cut that in. You got to cut it right here, Josh, so it can roll. It's rolled in the Smithsonian.
Dude.
I have that playing in my office. If you came to my office, as Chatham Hughes' office, when you walk through my door, there's a like a 50-inch TV on my wall that just plays what's it called, Raiders of the Lost Ark on repeat. Oh.
It's just the scene repeat where the Nazis open up the.
I'm just trying to let people know what they're in for. All right, that's all I'm trying to do. All right,
Take off your shoes. You're entering holy ground.
yeah.
Can I respond to Nick's Presbyterian upbringing though, and the
Sure.
whole like you just have to believe thing?
I
Not
was-
like respond in an adversarial
sharing
sense.
about my experience
He was
and
being
how
vulnerable,
others might have
okay?
a similar
He's being
experience.
vulnerable, Tim.
I'm
know.
not saying I enjoyed living under
You guys
a rock.
are so keyed up that I'm just going to start throwing haymakers. I could be nice.
Hey, you know what?
Hey, the
Don't
audience
dog the
has seen previous
Presbyterians.
episodes, Tim.
Yeah, they know what's up.
I wanted to expand on a point that Nick made.
Let's do it.
Because he
Go
was
on.
talking about that whole like, well, you just have to, you're just supposed to believe, you know, if you need evidence, blah 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 blah, and
Pray harder.
that's just not true. Okay,
Yeah.
the apostle doubting Thomas, right? He said, "Blessed are you because you have seen and believed." Right now, there was obviously more to that, but guess what? There's a whole bunch of people in the past, present, who have seen
Yeah.
and still chosen not to believe.
That's right.
Okay, so if you running headfirst into a signpost of evidence bootstraps you into your leap into faith, you don't have to feel worse about your faith.
That's right.
Because your faith is based on the thing that it points to, not the thing that pointed you there. And so if someone, you know, in 1978, you know, the knowledge of the Shroud of Turin at that time, you know, put them on a you know, path towards faith or whatever. which is not like an unrealistic story, by the way. People are moved by these connections between the world that we live in and the divine. And they later was like, oh, in 1988, 10 years later, it's like, oh, this is fake. Well, my assumption is that true faith in that intervening time would have developed in a genuine sense, and that person knew when the now known to be fraudulent carbon dating was performed that, my faith was never really based on that. That just kind of pointed me, it forced me to confront the reality of the divine and the supernatural. So the idea that you're somehow a person of lesser faith or lesser conviction, or your faith is weaker because it was prompted by some of these external things is just false. And so don't feel nervous about putting some stock, about being edified by the evidence that you see, some of which you may have, your opinions on it may change in the future. Right. And that's okay.
And the reality is, like, we don't want to base our faith on something that we could be argued out of, right? Our faith is based on evidence, but also on the things that we are experiencing in a relationship with God as well. So, but here, let me bring this into a more evidence-based discussion for the resurrection, because here's the thing. Even if we didn't have the Shroud of Turin, which I think now is, I think we could safely say is pretty decent evidence that at least it was someone that matched the wounds of Christ and it was authentic. It's hard to
lit up like a
argue against it.
5 million BTU candle miraculously
I
without
just want to
burning
talk
it.
about that.
Yes,
somebody
exactly.
Let's Gandalf it. Like, what's that about? Like, that sounds amazing.
Well, okay, so one of the things that I think there's the main things are the death of Christ, the burial of Christ, the empty tomb, and then the resurrection of Christ. Those are the three kind of main things. And a lot of this work, and just to put it out there, a lot of work has been done, scholarly work has been done, at first by Wolfhart Pennenberg, William Lane Craig, N.T. Wright, and Gary Habermas from Liberty University.
Shout out.
Alma mater there. So, there has been so much evidence and research done on this, and that's just the people that would be considered the resurrection scholars. You got Mike Lacona, you've got Sean McDowell did a study on the disciples and stuff like that, and their deaths and their profession of faith. So there's a lot of evidence out there outside of even these kind of standards. But the evidence for the death of Christ is not just attested independently in the four Gospels, as well as in the epistles afterwards. It's also attested in secular commentaries or histories, right? So if you look at the background, Tacitus, right? He writes that Christians from whom the name had its origin suffered the extreme penalty, dying during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our proctors, Pontius Pilate. Okay, that's confirmation. At least what we know in the Bible is saying that particular aspect is true. Suetonius talks about Christians and getting their name from Christ and being the Jews being expelled from Rome, which was something that we see in Acts. We also see Josephus. Now, granted, people have argued over the authenticity of his quote, but he literally says, like, Jesus was a wise man, he had followers that loved him, and that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. So the outside, you got Pliny the Younger and a few others from history that we would say, okay, these are attestations that Christ, extra biblical evidence that Christ was actually crucified. These are not people that are biased, that have skin in the game when it comes to Christianity being authentic. What we can
all
find
of them
from
went
this
to
is
their
that
deaths.
You wouldn't view it as controversial to say, hey, that guy was alive at one point.
Right.
Like,
and because of how in your face these comments are, many modern scholars today are looking at and trying to comb through how they can say, this isn't really accurate, or this wouldn't be true. And it's like, talk about bad scholarship, trying to find the result before you do the actual investigation. It's terrible.
Absolutely. You have more physical, documented evidence in terms of writings, ancillary or tertiary artifacts that relate to the events being described. You have more of that to support the existence of Jesus. Granted, like the aspects like the resurrection and stuff, but just his existence as a historical human being who did things like what the Bible describes. You have more evidence of that than Alexander the Great.
Yeah,
that's right.
Like people do, people argue against the stability of the text of the Bible over time. And it's like, oh, so do you think we have a relatively accurate copy of the Odyssey?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
because you have like a third as many
Or the
examples
Iliad.
of that.
Right?
It's not
Yeah.
even funny.
Or the
Like
Iliad,
it's
that's-
not even
yeah.
it's not even comparable.
Yeah. Right. I mean, well, you
Right.
look at
It's like-
to go on that Alexander the Great theory, right? The first writings that we have of Alexander the Great are somewhere along the lines of 325 years after his death. But the most authoritative biographies of Alexander the Great come at 425 to 450 years after his death. You know what the longest period of time of the last gospel, the Gospel of John, is
John
kind
or
of
Mark?
dated to? Plus John. Mark is the first one. John is the last one.
Of course
right?
it's
so
John.
it's plus 65 years.
Yeah.
At most.
Yeah, the last.
Right?
It's the worst.
Plus
Yeah.
65
Mark's the earliest,
years
yeah.
after the death of Christ that it was written down. Now we have arguably that it was Mark was the first one, Matthew,
40.
and then Luke being written within
40 AD.
within that time frame, 30 to 65 years after the death of Christ. So anyway, but that's not to say, well, we'll get into the reliability of the Bible, because the reliability of the Bible, I think, is a big factor on that.
Josh
But
is very
the
passionate
empty
about this.
tomb. Right. Well, that's
guys
what I
can't
went to school
tell.
for. All right. So
So-
the
Hold on,
reliability
Josh,
of the.
Josh,
sorry,
pause
go
real
ahead.
quick.
Go ahead.
1 second, Josh.
We're gonna
I'm going
break.
to say a thing.
We're gonna break from the
Let's
apologetics
talk.
class.
Keep
Hold on.
your eyes on signal for a sec.
Oh, sorry.
So I
I'm
was
on a
gonna
roll,
say,
guys.
I was gonna. It's awesome. Don't stop. One thing I think that's fascinating is that, and I'm curious what your guys' take on this is. It seems like in the 21st century, culturally speaking, and historically,
Historically,
Yeah, historicity. Or
the
historically.
existence of Jesus is no longer disputed. And the reason I'm so fascinated by this conversation and the new evidence we have around the Shroud of Turin is because it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller around that which we don't have evidence of, that like showcases the pinnacle hinge point of our faith. And I just think it's kind of like God giggling, where he's like, okay, so like we know the dude was alive and we know he was crucified. We have enough history. No one's disputing any of that. Then we get these like, well, maybe they stole the body out of the tomb. And like, and so like those dots
Right.
start to get a little bit fuzzy around, all right, we all acknowledge he lived. We all acknowledge he was crucified.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, to Anderson's point, 65 years later, we now have the
Four
trust
Gospels.
we can have of these four gospels and the story that it tells. But there is this gap of 65 years. The coolness of the Shroud of Turin is like, hey, we just got a potential evidence component or blip in the other side of the cross.
From a
and it's just
scientific
kind of
evidence,
a
yeah.
fun addition to this that I'm
Archaeological.
enjoying.
yeah, and it's important, and Josh will probably talk about this too. But you know, this important thing is like we talk about like the Gospel of Mark, which Josh, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's 40 AD. That's the
around
earliest
that.
fragment
Yeah. Well,
that we have somewhere
yeah.
ballpark. Don't quote us on
Well,
it. It's in
That's what it was thought to have been created.
Sure.
The earliest copy is a little bit later.
But it's a but that's one point. It itself, the oldest fragment that we have, is a copy. And so to that end, what we're saying is that like we have to remember we're in the ancient world. Copies aren't made like that. Copies aren't distributed like that. So when we have copies of the Synoptic Gospels around the entire area of the Levant and Asia Minor, saturated to the point that we're finding them 2,000 years later, and think about that. All right, that's not a small thing. 2,000 years later, we're finding copies of copies of copies of copies that the copies date to within 60 years. Well, I think it takes more than 60 years to reach that level of critical mass. And so what that tells you is that with a relative amount of certainty that the original documents would have had to have been created, distributed well before that,
Right.
well before that.
Okay, I'm about to go scorched earth because I mean I think that really you're absolutely right, because here's the thing, man, guys. Like we have the Bible, and here's what I get so frustrated about when you hear people say, "Well, the Bible is just written by men," or it's just written, it was compiled over and it was changed, or the Muslims say it was corrupted and all these things. Like you couldn't know possibly what it was written on it. But how about 5,500 plus manuscripts of the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, all of which we could reconstruct the Bible together? What about 10,000 Latin Vulgate transcripts, or the 8,000 Syrian Coptic transcripts that we have that we can compose the Bible. If we didn't even have that, we have 36,000 quotations of the Bible from the early church, that all from that you could put together the entire Bible together. Don't tell us we don't have evidence, and we use textual criticism, and textual criticism allows us to see where the changes were done either by mistake or intentionally. So what even Bart Ehrman says in his book with Bruce Metzger, that in his book Misquoting Jesus at the end, he says we are not denying the fact that we have pretty much what the Bible was originally written. There's 40 passages that don't affect any of our theology, that might or may not have been modified, changed, or there's errors. That it's just not even comparable. Nothing else in antiquity has the amount of evidence that we have for the Bible. So if you want to complain, you're going to be in a vacuum of your own self-denial.
Say Christ is Lord.
Say Christ is Lord.
Say Christ is Lord.
Say Christ is Lord.
Clip it
Anyway.
in. That's so perfect.
So yes, we're going to use the Bible as historical evidence. Right? Anyway.
Well, especially when your scientific evidence, your physical evidence, keeps ratcheting us closer and closer to the biblical narrative over time, despite the best efforts of the practitioners, of the primary practitioners of those disciplines.
Which this is the whole point. We keep talking about this gaslighting thing. Methinks she doth protest too much. What are you doing? We see, we understand. It does not take. We go back to, this is like the rich young ruler, right? The parable of the rich young ruler. He's like, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? What must I, all these things I've done. I've studied all these things. I'm a knowledgeable young man. I've got means. I'm taking, what must I do? Oh, you must do this. You must do this. You must. Hey, I've done all of those things. He's like, okay, cool. Well, then sell everything you have and follow me. And the man walked away sad because he was wealthy and he had much to lose. And see, this is what it comes down to. Intellectually, we have come to think that we have it all figured out, that we have the capacity to define our own destiny, that we can maintain our own autonomy, that we'll live forever. And the fruit of this is evident. It's the transhumanism movement. It's all of this. It's all of this stuff that comes out of that.
And hedonism.
And hedonism, exactly. And so we don't have to guess. We can look at what it's actually birthing, and it's sad because the reality is, and this is to Tim's point, the evidence is there. Right. The people, just because you can show it, and this is ultimately something else. Don't think that just because we found evidence, or just because that now there's going to be all these people who are going to be changed to come to faith. No, the same people who have turned their nose up at all of the evidence that already existed will continue to walk away sad because they had much to lose. Right?
Like Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham. It's if they didn't believe the prophets and they didn't believe the teachers, then they're not going to believe me if I rise from the dead and tell them.
Bingo.
That's right. So the last
paraphrase.
That was good.
Let me just go over the last two pieces of evidence: the empty tomb and the actual sightings of Jesus after, and then we can kind of wrap this up. But let me get through this really quick. Basically, and I'm going to use the Bible because it's a good source of evidence. In Matthew 28:11-15, the Jewish authorities spread the story that Jesus' disciples stole his body from the tomb. But the funny thing is the enemies of Jesus just confirmed that the tomb was empty. It was empty.
The Romans.
Right? Justin Martyr and Tertullian both mentioned that claim that Jesus' body was stolen as the response to the actual empty tomb, right? Oh, it was stolen. It was stolen. And modern skeptics will say, well, crucifixion was by slaves and outcasts, and what happened was they were crucified and then their bodies rotted and they fell to the ground and they were eaten by dogs. There is no evidence that any kind of crucifixion victim was ever buried. But come new archaeological evidence, we have all of these ossuaries.
I wonder why that was specifically mentioned.
Right.
Joseph of Arimathea, who we have his name specifically, whose tomb it was, and why that was worth mentioning. Is it there? Oh, yeah, cool story, bro. You're right. That didn't happen. And so that would explain why in the ancient texts that are historically relevant and, worth reading, state specifically that this guy gave up his tomb for
I've been
a crucifix
I've
fact.
been to the 2 potential tomb sites. You know, we kind of know where they are.
Right.
It's not a big question.
Right.
Shocking.
Well, and the claim.
Tim,
I think,
your audio's
Tim, you're
dead. You're
muted.
muted. Tim, you're muted.
You're muted.
Tim, you're muted. Tim, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was
I really
lighting
wanted
you
to
up
hear
so
that.
hard right there. You said you are like the
It
most
was the Lord.
stereotypical.
It was.
I was really nice last time, and you're
He's
making
on
me
my
regret
side.
it. This is why people don't change.
They
Look,
perish
okay,
for
so
lack of
the
understanding.
claim that there's no evidence of a crucifixion victim in being given an actual proper burial. We look at ossuaries, which are the box that they kept the bones of the Jewish deceased. Well, in those boxes, we actually find bones with their ankle bones pierced by a Roman nail, 9-inch nail, and it's like, oh, these are crucifixion victims. It's not just one, not just two. It's a whole lot that we're actually finding. Which, honestly, if you want to go and tell me, oh, there's no evidence that there was an empty tomb or that crucifixion victims were ever given proper burial, we got the nail in the coffin to convince you, right? That's literally what we have. Then the last thing would be the evidence of the appearances, the post-resurrection. I mean, we have from the creeds,
Not the Mormon
early
ones.
creeds.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, not
gold
not
tablets
not
are
the
not-
post, not the appearances in America.
Okay. So we're
but
clear.
in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, Paul says that in the early, it was like an early Christian creed that he's repeating, and he says that the appearances of Jesus included appearances to Cephas or Peter, to the 12 disciples, more than 500 brothers at one time, James the apostle, and Paul, or James the brother of Jesus, and Paul himself. Right, like we have radical attestations of people that were opposed to Christ that are suddenly following Christ. You look at the Apostle Paul. There's good evidence that he went to his death, was beheaded because of his faith, proclaiming the resurrected Christ. I think one of the biggest evidences is James, and this I'll kind of leave it here. Within Josephus, one of the writer of the Jewish Wars and Antiquities, he wrote that James, the brother or half-brother of Christ, was not a skeptic. He wasn't a believer in Jesus, and he came to faith after seeing the resurrected Lord. And he was thrown off of the temple mount and broke his legs, and then was stoned to death. I mean, this is not somebody, and this is somebody that previously didn't believe. That's an extra biblical resource.
Right.
That's
And
not
Josh,
coming
let me,
from the Bible.
I know I also just brought up the Mormons, but like, let me just give you some perspective here, okay? When you want to make up things about having witnesses to things happening, you do what Joseph Smith did. And you have 8 witnesses. It's like, look, all these people saw the gold tablets. Joseph, all these people are related to you. They're all explicitly, by marriage, and it's kind of a weird thing. You know what I mean? Like 100-something people. So it's like, oh, no, there were 8. There were 8 of them, and they held the
signed an
tablets.
affidavit to which
and
they later left
signed
the church.
the affidavit of the gold plates that they found. No, and again, I keep coming back to this ultimately to kind of, land the plane with this, is that like one of the ultimate testimony is the fruit, right? And this is what it keeps coming back to. We joke, that episode where we did, you can't gaslight us. What do we have? Human history, Western
What was it called
civilization. What?
You can't
You
what?
can't gaslight us. That
I
little
wish we need
jingle.
like a tune or
we need like
something
a
to help
tune
me.
with that. We'll cut that in. But the
Get
idea
off
is,
my
hold
lawn.
on. Can't gaslight us. Anyway, but my point is that you just look at the, okay? This is the reality. It's that you can backwards assess a theory. You can work from a result, or you can work from first principles. And for some reason everyone wants to talk about why Christianity needs to work from first principles, even though we have as much evidence as anybody else does. But ultimately
More.
we're right, if not more, right. But ultimately let's just look at the fruit. What these people went to their deaths proclaiming the veracity of their tales, and not just during the first century. Go read Silence. Read about the Japanese, priests, the Jesuits, and the Japanese converts that went to their deaths because they wouldn't denounce, Christ. Read Fox's Book of Martyrs. Like, And I understand martyrdom is not a unique thing to Christianity. However, it's what comes out of the worldview apart from that. It's like people were willing to die for the veracity of the truth claims, and their lives reflected the reality of the teachings and the gospel. The fruit that the gospel promised is what is borne out in the lives of these people and what they taught. What are we seeing from Bart Ehrman? What are we seeing from the transhumanism movement? Like, I'm sorry, show me a titan of science whose life you want.
Cosmic Skeptic gave an interview with I think it was it William Johnston or Williamson, Chris Williamson. I guess we had done a video. He did an interview, and one of the interesting things that he said is he stops doing the debates on God doesn't exist, and the reason he stops doing that is because he feels guilty. Because people keep coming up to him and saying, I'm so glad that you were able to prove and convince me that God doesn't exist. But what do I do now? And he's like, I don't have an answer. You better
Joke's on you,
have
nerd.
an answer to that question.
Say
and so
Christ
he's
is
like,
Lord.
now I go over the apocryphal or the Gnostic texts and stuff like that. I just don't like putting people in that position where they, are having an existential crisis. Like,
I do.
So anyway.
And on that note, like and
If
subscribe.
you are still here, you can subscribe, hit the bell. We would love to hear your comments. Is this the first time you've ever heard about the Shroud of Turin? Did you grow up like I did, where all of this kind of is new conversations? Did you already know about all the evidence? And we love hearing from you guys. We love engaging in the comments. If you still think Christianity is not real, leave us a comment. We're happy to introduce you to Jesus in the comment section.
Pick a fight with Josh. Pick a fight with Josh Anderson. He'll be in the comments all day. If you disagree with something we said, by all means, throw it in there. Josh is going to be in there, lighten you up. It's going to be good. Just be prepared.
This has been another episode of the I'm Telling God About This podcast. This was a fun one. Good job, gents.
All right.
Till next
See you
time.
guys
Christ is Lord.
Say Christ is Lord.
Bye.